There's two types of people, they say. Nah, I laugh because there's so much more to life than that. Most of the time, they're being facetious. That's one of countless differences between people and computers. We're smart enough to get sarcasm for the sake of a good story. Computers don't really understand it. Here we are, living in a future where artificial intelligence is pervasive. We have unfathomable processing power in our pockets, limitless data swirling all around us. So what type of person are you? Are you someone who thinks that the robots will save us? Or are you more likely to talk about our robot overlords enslaving us? Probably you're in between, a combination of thoughts and complicated feelings. That's human. Technology has accelerated so quickly we haven't quite been able to make sense of it. The terms machine learning, deep learning, robotic process automation, and neural networks are becoming more familiar. Though they operate outside our view and understanding, we have a general awareness that these technologies are commonly used to design our digital experience. Most people don't know how they actually work. It's arguable that no one really understands the whole picture. We see them changing the ways we interact with the world around us, and we undoubtedly benefit from the revolution. But we must acknowledge our responsibility for minimizing the risks of this inconceivable network. Machines simply monitor associations by applying the rules they're taught. Code can often be constructed too narrowly to capture the nuance of human reality. It makes mistaken assumptions about time, names, gender, ethnicity, family, jobs, many of the areas of our lives. Despite the potential for minimizing human error, it has the potential for amplifying our misunderstandings. This is the paradox in which I work. I am both delighted by the opportunity of software helping us and still cautious about the opportunity for catastrophic misdirection. As a software and diversity consultant working in AI, I gather teams of people to discuss the intersections of social science, data science, and political science. We sit together, engineers, analysts, lawyers, doctors, executives, anyone willing to dig deep and explore implicit bias. Our conversation zooms between the macro and micro perspectives, thinking about long timelines, huge data sets, large sample sizes, and then moving into the minutia of the code, sometimes line by line, function by function, variable by variable. Our conversation covers all of the implications around what it means to be working on diversity in software. Models are based on algorithms and AI. These formulas are unambiguous, but they're often full of variables with nebulous assumptions. Prejudices can be inadvertently embedded in the code. People who work in technology sincerely want to do good, but they need our thoughtful guidance. Non-binary gender is a problem for the naive logic of computer programming. Assumptions we used to rely on, that there are only two sexes that correspond with two genders, are oversimplistic and incomplete. They're a false dichotomy, and they're easily disproven. An abundance of research shows that psychological and physiological traits exist along a continuum, not a binary. People aren't just male or female, but can be gender fluid, agender, transgender, or any of an ever-growing mix of gender identities. Yet most of our society's rules follow back to those two original gender categories. There are plenty of ways to include more. Some of the time, it makes sense to offer a few dozen gender options. Other times, it's possible to provide a free-form field for custom responses. Even in highly regulated industries, we're seeing change. Some airlines are offering X gender and extra genders beyond that. Prefixes and pronouns are growing too. It's not just Mr. and Mrs., not just ma'am and sir. I often hear complaints like, "It's too difficult to keep up with this gender stuff." To which I reply, "You ought to, because it's happening regardless." Defying the status quo takes a lot of thought and a lot of work. Non-binary people are working to inform those of us with the privilege of not having thought as critically about gender. It's up to all of us to keep up. This is one of the biggest challenges and most common topics we face in the work we do. Once we recognize that there are more than two genders, systemic changes follow. So if governments allow gender designations beyond M and F on driver's licenses and birth certificates, the software needs to be edited to adapt to that change. Most registration forms still require us to select male or female before allowing progress to the next field. For non-binary people, neither option is relevant. Even if it doesn't matter for the work at hand, their selection will populate the algorithm, changing their digital experience and leading to real-life consequences. Here's an example that troubles me. Some companies try to calculate a formula that makes sure that it limits mistakes in the coding. One such setting is a conditional algorithm that rejects any healthcare claim with a diagnosis or procedure code not associated with a particular sex. So, if something is populating the field for example, a prostate exam with a female gender marker, it'll get kicked out because it's been coded to think that's an impossible combination. But there are trans women with prostates, and they need exams. Situations like this are scattered throughout the code, and they're difficult to find, especially by people who are impacted by them. Once we learn, we need to teach our tools. A computer can only process the variables by which it's given, so we need to give it as many options as possible. Better yet, we can encode the feature for people to add their own. Incomplete options become inaccurate inputs that inevitably skew the data. Most models use proxies, indirectly correlating certain behaviors to traits. These decision trees are often relying on old and easy ways of thinking. Models are based on guesses about what matters, what variables can be counted, and how to calculate them. It's often difficult to know what assumptions were made when writing the code. Models are based on the premise that we want to replicate a pattern, but collectively we want progress. We should consider how we want the world to be, not just automate, replicate, and scale what already exists. AI's predictive models can perpetuate problems, or they can narrow the social divide. We can wield this power however we want if we're intentional about our choices. Programmers can create pathways to diversity with their design decisions. If a model is only trained to recognize two genders, it'll fail to recognize non-binary people like these. They have combinations of traits that confuse AI. A program needs to be adaptive so that it can recognize non-binary genders and other outliers. Variation is a feature, not a flaw. If a model doesn't work, it shouldn't just default to a generic user experience. That wastes important opportunities for learning from the edge cases. We need to log the outliers and integrate them into future releases. If the numbers don't add up, it's likely because we've oversimplified the inputs. If a toothbrush company asks me, "Are you male or female?" why do they need to know? I'm not convinced that that's a trait that they need to capture. How are they going to implement that answer into my life? I think that they should ask me something more relevant, like my bristle preferences. Applications of my answer can be applied anywhere, but they're rarely relevant. So, how can we intervene to avert unfortunate outcomes? No matter where you are in relationship to AI, there are ways you can participate. If you work in tech, it's your responsibility to get engaged in diversity quickly. I bet you already are. If so, go deeper. Interrogate your assumptions. Invite more diverse and contrary contributors to your logic mapping sessions. Make sure you include people across as many demographics as you can imagine, and then invite them to invite more people. Invite them to invite their opposites. Including those people in your planning sessions will help you represent them accurately in your models. Business people, policymakers, you're responsible not only for one model or program, but for multitudes. Interrogate your outputs and your success metrics, because profit is not proof. AI's efficiency can save money, but at what costs? Stay in touch with your personal ethics, not just the financial goals of your organization. Best practices have been outlined in charters by corporations, manifestos by institutes, and declarations by governments. Many have been implemented, but most haven't. They're simple, but they're not easy to do. You can prioritize transparency, which is a necessary step to finding the problems in the logic. It's not enough that the code is surfaced and available, but it has to be intelligible. Regular people need to understand these complex algorithms. We all deserve to know the rules by which we are governed. All of us are happenstance users of AI, and therefore contributors to its dynamic models. We can adapt code to fit our lives. If a question doesn't work for you, refuse it or confuse it. When the toothbrush company asks you an answer that is incorrect or incomplete, let them know that it's a problem. Consumer power is mighty. Challenging our assumptions as we build AI will ultimately bring us to a new understanding of who we are. Our worth is not quantifiable. We can help AI get better, and it will return the favor. Thank you.